Okay, so hi everyone and welcome to this video. This is your captain speaking. My name is Ross and today we are looking at correct comma use. Now, in terms of punctuation, commas are actually by far the most common area where students make mistakes. So in this video, I just want to identify some of the problem areas with commas and try to remove some of the confusion surrounding comma use. And to do that, I have here a number of sentences. Each of these sentences has at least one comma in it. What I would like you to do is pause the recording, read through the sentences, look at the commas in them, and decide to yourself, are the commas right or wrong? Should they be there or not? And think about why. Okay then, so pause the recording here and come back when you're ready. Okay then, let's rattle through them. So in the first case, there are several themes, comma, that this paper deals with. Here, the comma is incorrect, so I've removed it here, and it is incorrect because we will not have a comma before the word that in English, generally. So bear that in mind because that is probably the most common mistake that students make regarding commas. Next, we have two sentences which are very similar. The team, comma, which is based in New York, is leading the project. And next, the team, comma, which is based in New York, comma, is leading the project. Here, it really depends. In both cases, we have relative clauses. In the first case, we had an attempt at a defining relative clause, and in the second case, we had a non-defining relative clause. So, what do each of those things mean? Let's go through them. We'll begin on the left-hand side with a defining relative clause, which should not have a comma. So as you can see, I've removed it here. So a defining relative clause gives the reader essential information. Information without which the context of the sentence will not be fully clear to the reader. And a defining relative clause will also identify one thing from a group. So in this case, there is actually more than one team. Let's say there's a team in London, there's a team in Sydney, and there's a team in New York. But it is the team which is based in New York that is leading the project. And if the reader knows that there are three teams, and you just said to them, the team is leading the project, the reader would of course ask, which team? The Sydney team, the London team, or the New York team? So here the relative clause gives us essential information, and that makes it a defining relative clause, and that means we have no comma before the word which. Next then, on the right hand side, the non-defining relative clause. The team, comma, which is based in New York, comma, is leading the project. Here, a defining relative clause will always give us extra non-essential information. So in the sentence on the right hand side, the information which is between the commas is as if it is in parentheses, in brackets. So it is just extra information. And non-defining relative clauses do not identify one thing from a group. So in this sentence, there is not more than one team. In this case, the reader knows that there is only one team, and if you said the team is leading the project, then the reader would think, fine. They would not ask you which team because they know that there is only one team. So this information that the team is based in New York is just extra additional information for the reader. So bear this in mind. A lot of people think that any time they write the word which, they have to put a comma before it. But that is not the case. You have to decide to yourself, am I writing a defining relative clause or a non-defining relative clause? And that will tell you whether or not you need a comma. Next then, we were unable to finish the project, comma, there was not enough time. Here, the comma is incorrect, and that is because we have a comma splice. Now, a comma splice is where you have two independent clauses, meaning two clauses which grammatically could stand on their own as sentences, and you punctuate them with a comma. Now, this is incorrect in English. So what can you do instead? Well, you could use a semicolon, as I have done here. you could use a full stop and just begin a new sentence, as I have done here. Or you could use an independent clause and a dependent clause and begin the dependent clause with a subordinating conjunction, which the word because is in this sentence. So we were unable to finish the project, comma, because there was not enough time. So those would be your options there, but you cannot punctuate two independent clauses with a comma. Okay then. Next, when engineers start, comma, their plans must be clear. Now, in this case, the comma is perfectly fine because we have an introductory phrase. So, with an introductory phrase, you can have a comma. You don't have to have one, but you can have one. The only time when you really must have a comma in an introductory phrase, I would say, is when if you did not have that comma, the reader might be confused. And that is the case in this sentence. Because if you don't have this comma, the reader would probably think that the word engineers is the subject, start is the verb, and their plans is the object. And that is not the case. So we want that comma there to avoid any confusion. As a rule, I would say just be consistent about your introductory phrases and comma use with them. So the easiest thing is probably just to put commas after all introductory phrases, because that way you keep consistent. But you don't necessarily have to do that. But just try to be consistent in the patterns that you use commas in introductory phrases. Okay then. Next, we have the sentence, the highly contested issues of water availability and rights, comma, have further complicated the construction of the dam. Now this is incorrect, and I've removed the comma here because it separated the subject from the verb. So in this sentence, the subject is the following: the highly contested issues of water availability and rights. All of that is the subject, and then the verb is have further complicated. So we cannot have a comma before the word have, because that separates the subject and the verb. Very often people make this mistake because they have a long subject and they mistake that for an introductory phrase. So you have to be able to tell the difference between a long subject and an introductory phrase. Okay then, next we have two sentences. She learned it, comma, while she was at university, and while they were students, comma, they did several internships. Again, here it would depend. So here, in both cases, we have sentences that include a dependent clause and an independent clause. And whether or not you use a comma depends on whether that dependent clause comes second or whether it comes first. So in the first sentence, we don't need the comma, and we wouldn't usually have it because we have an independent clause plus a dependent clause. So she learned it is the independent clause, and while she was at university is the dependent clause. And we wouldn't have a comma before while here. However, if you have a dependent clause plus an independent clause, then you usually have a comma after the dependent clause that begins the sentence. So here, while they were students is the dependent clause, so we put the comma after it before we get to the independent clause. They did several internships. Okay then, here we have the sentence, volatile organic compounds include benzene, comma, methylene chloride, comma, and percolate. Okay, I'm not even going to try to pretend I actually know how to pronounce this word, but maybe one of you knows how to pronounce it. In any case, this is actually fine. All of the commas are fine here. So the first two commas, the first comma after benzene, this is just a comma for a list. Now the one that occurs after methylene chloride and before and, that is perhaps the one you might have asked yourself questions over. Do you really have a comma before and in a list? The answer to that is that you do not have to have a comma. before the word and. But you can have one, and this is known as the Oxford comma. It's known as the Oxford comma because it was Oxford University Press which first started doing it. Although ironically, the Oxford comma is actually used more in the United States than it is in the United Kingdom. Fun fact for you there. And the rationale behind the Oxford comma is that it is supposed to prevent any confusion. So sometimes people might think the last two things in the list are one thing. So they might theoretically think that methylene chloride and this percolalalala are one thing if you do not have the comma there. So it's up to you. You can use the Oxford comma, you can choose not to use the Oxford comma. Personally, I use it because I like it, but there is no requirement for you to use it. Okay then, next two sentences. Each of our surveys had a sample size of 1,007 people and our grade point average is an excellent 3,95. So here we're dealing with numbers in each case. However, only one of the sentences is correct. So each of our surveys had a sample size of 1,007 people. This is correct when we're dealing with numbers over 1,000. Then we tend to have a comma before another three numbers. So 9,987 has a comma before the 987. 157,583 has a comma before the 583, and then 7 million has a comma before each of those three zeros. For the decimal one though, that was incorrect, and it should be a decimal point as I have replaced it with here. So it should not be 3,95, it should be 3.95. Or another example here, 147.98. So bear that in mind when we're dealing with decimals in English. We have a decimal point, not a comma. Okay then, that was pretty much everything for this video. Thanks very much for watching. As ever, if there are any questions, let me know. Either shoot me an email, talk to me in class. Otherwise, cheers, I'll see you next time, and stay awesome, I guess.